What I want to show you today is how to navigate the storm. And we're going to learn from their experiences, from these disciples' experiences. So let's start reading this story together in Mark chapter 4, verse 35 through 40. And it says this: As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross to the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. Now I want to say this. Storms are going to come, right? They are going to come into your life. It's just a reality. You can count on it. But there's different reasons for storms. And one reason that we see in Scripture is that whenever we are disobedient to God, whenever we get away from God, that's when God sends storms in our life, right? To get us back on track. To finally submit and say, "God, I surrender. I surrender. I'm yours." Right? You can see it throughout Scripture. Jonah, right? Running away from God. What does God do? He sends a storm, right?
Yeah.
Until finally Jonah relents and says, "God, I surrender." Right? You study the book of Judges and you see the cycle of the Israelites. Everything is great. They're being blessed because they're serving God. And then all of a sudden they start worshiping idols. They start getting away from God. What happens? All hell breaks loose, right? All the foreign enemies come and attack them, capture them, put them, take them back to their land. And they're held in captivity, right? And it's not until they finally get right with God that He starts bringing them back in, right? And starts blessing them again. And then they go through it all over again, right? We see this pattern. When we are disobedient, storms can come into our life. And I think most of us know that, right? But what some people think, or mistakenly think, is that if God is charting my course, if I'm obedient to God, then I'm never going to experience a storm. If I'm right with God, man, I'm going to have smooth sailing. But I want you to see from this story that the disciples were following Jesus' command. Jesus said, "Go across the lake." And they did. They jumped in the boat, and Jesus was with them, and they started paddling. And you can just imagine that they were thinking, "Hey, this is going to be great. We're just going to go straight across. No problems, no hassles." Why? Because Jesus told us to go, right? And we're following Him. We're being obedient. But in the midst of their obedience, this storm raged. This storm attacked them. And it was so bad and so horrendous that they were freaking out. And yet they were obedient. You see, we often think, hey, if I'm obedient, then nothing's going to happen. And that's not true. You see, God uses storms to test us. God puts us in situations that our character and our faith is tested. And these tests are God's tools for how He purifies us, how He shapes our character. Listen to this. I want you to see this. The Bible describes this process as the refining process. Listen to this in Isaiah 48, verse 10. It says this: "I have made you pure, not by fire, as silver is made pure. I have purified you by giving you troubles." This is God speaking. He's saying, listen, I'm going to give you troubles in your life so that it will purify you. And He references silver. And if you know anything about refining silver or even gold, what you do is you take that raw gold or that raw silver and you stick it in a fire, in like a cup or a bowl, and you stick it in the fire until it melts. And as it melts and heats up, all those impurities rise to the surface. And that silversmith or that goldsmith will take a spoon and scoop out those impurities. And then he'll do it again and again and the more he does it, the more pure that gold is, the more pure that silver is. but he has to use the fire. And it's in the same way that God uses trouble in our life, storms in our life, to bring out those impurities so that he can purify us. Now, there's two temptations we face when we go through a storm. The first one is what I like to call a spiritual tantrum. We are tempted to throw a spiritual tantrum, right? Basically what that is we get angry at God for allowing the storm, right? And so what we do is we respond with rebellion, right? We know God doesn't want us to do this, but the minute we hit this storm, we get rebellious, we get petulant, right? Like children, and we go, you know what? I'm going to do this over here. I don't even care anymore. If God has told you to stop smoking cigarettes, you're like, you know what? I'm going to light up because I need a cigarette right now, right? Because you're just like, I'm done. I'm done with this, right? Or you do something else, something that you know you shouldn't be doing, you start doing. Spiritual tantrum. But here's the thing. When we act that way, we become rebellious. And what did we learn just a minute ago about when we become rebellious? What does God do? He brings the storm, right? So if you want that storm to relent, to dissipate, the last thing you want to do is get rebellious, right?
That's right.
You need to be obedient. Now, the other temptation we go through when we hit these storms of life is to freak out and begin to take matters into our own hands. Instead of listening to God and following Him, we try to jump ship or change direction, right? We're like, man, I got to change my situation, right? I've got to take care of it. I've got to deal with this problem. But what we need to do is we need to keep paddling in the direction God has told us to go in and trust Him to take care of what we can't control.
Amen.
If you're having a marital crisis, the temptation is to give up and get a divorce. But God says, no. I want you to work it out. I want you to do everything in your power to work it out and trust me with what you can't control. If you've lost your job, the temptation might be to look for a way to cheat the system, like lying to unemployment or faking an injury to claim disability and get a few extra bucks, right? But God says, no. You be honest. You do the right thing. And you trust me to take care of what you can't control. You trust me. You be obedient. You do what I told you to do. And I will calm the storm. You see, God has given you a direction for your life. And though it gets rough, we have to keep paddling and trust God with what we can't control.
That's right.
Because there's going to be things that you can't control. But you got to do exactly what the disciples should have done, is just keep paddling. Keep paddling. Keep heading in the direction that God has laid out for you. And say, God, I'm not giving up. I'm not going to be rebellious. I'm not going to jump ship. I'm not going to change direction. I'm going to continue to move forward in the direction you have laid out for me. And I'm going to trust you with what I can't control. Recently, I shared with you a little while ago, my wife and I and my family actually went on vacation. It was before Christmas. It was actually during Thanksgiving. And just to give you a little bit of background, before we went on this trip, we were financially struggling. And we had some needs that was just overwhelming. But we felt like we could manage to at least go on this trip and just get away for a little while, be with family. And then as we went, it got more expensive than we thought, so we were in more trouble. And it was like, and then, and top it all off, all these things started to go wrong. So we were already struggling. We already had all of these problems and all these issues. And then in the midst of this, what was supposed to be a restful time, an easy time, it became super stressful. Everything was going wrong. Our RV was breaking down. The batteries in our RV blew up. We had to, that cost $275 that we didn't have. I mean, it was just crazy. I mean, it was just one thing after another. Bam, bam, bam. And I'm going, what in the world? And I'm thinking to myself, how are we going to survive this? Because we were already in trouble before we got on this trip, and now this trip has just blown us out of the water. On top of that, we had things we needed, our tires on our truck were bald, and we had no money to replace those. And, our brakes, well, actually, we found that out later, but our brakes were bad. We didn't even know that either. I mean, it was just like one thing after another. And I remember just kind of freaking out a little bit. And I was praying, and I remember God spoke to me, and He gave me this passage, this story. And He says, listen, don't freak out. Don't freak out, because I am the God who calms the storm. Amen. You trust me. You don't worry about what you can't control. You let me take care of that. You simply go in the direction that I've told you to go and trust me with what you can't control. End of the story is this past week and a half, God provided significantly for us. Someone's donated enough money that we were able not only to climb out of the hole, but pay for things that we desperately needed. Tires, brakes, all these things. But here's the thing, it was God. There was nothing on the horizon, folks. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't see a break in the storm. I couldn't see anything that says, hey, just wait out, another week or 2 weeks or whatever, and this is going to calm down. It's going to be okay. There was nothing like that. And maybe you're facing the same thing. You can't see a break in the storm. But God says, listen, you trust me. You trust me, and you keep going in the direction that I want you to go, and I will calm the storm.
Thank you, Lord Jesus.
Let's continue the story. The disciples are being obedient. They're crossing the lake like Jesus said. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" Listen, one of the things that I learned in my situation was, in these times, you're going to feel like God doesn't care. You're going to feel like He's absent from your situation. And I believe that happens believe it happened to so many people in the Bible who they're looking at their situation and they're in the midst of their situation and they're just kind of like, God, where are you? Don't you care? And what we need to know is that God does care. And He does have a plan. And He can calm the storm. And He will, yes, if we trust Him. But the disciples, they freaked out. When the wind was howling and the waves were crashing, they began to freak out. They were scared out of their minds. I think what scares you and I the most about the storms we face in life is the feeling of helplessness. Yep. We know, just like those disciples knew, that there is nothing we can do about our situation. We're not in control of the storm, and that scares us. I know what scared me. God, I don't have any way of taking care of this problem. I don't have any way of making the amount of money that I need to take care of all these needs. God, what am I going to do? But it's in those times that we remember, that we need to remember that even though we are not in control of the storm, God is.
Amen. Thank you, Lord Jesus.
God is in control of everything. There's never a moment in your life or my life or anybody's life where God goes, oops, I didn't catch that. Sorry about that. There's nothing that surprises God. There's nothing that scares him. In fact, listen to the scripture. I love this scripture because it's so encouraging. It says in Psalm 29 verse 10, it says this, "The Lord rules over the floodwaters. The Lord reigns as king forever." I love that. You know why? Because it says that when everything is out of control, God is still in control.
Amen.
Floods are not controlled things, right? They're things that are massively destructive. They're chaos. And this is saying, listen, God is in control of the chaos. He's king over the floodwaters. So whenever we face those crisis situations that make our life seem like it's out of control, we need to remember that God is in control. He controls the floodwaters. Here's the problem, though. We tend to freak out like the disciples do. But let me tell you this. Let me tell you what freak out means, what it says to God. It says, God, I don't trust that you have everything under control. I don't believe that even you are big enough to take care of the situation that I'm facing. I'm on my own. Look at the way that the disciples spoke to Jesus. He used to be their master. They used to be in awe of him. But now all of a sudden, they're talking to him like, don't you even care? We're going to drown, you included. They were like on the same level as Jesus now. They were treating him as if he was nobody. And that's what we do when we freak out. We're like, God, I don't even think you can take care of this. You're not big enough. You and I are going to face some intense situations in our lifetime, and they're going to be scary, but we have to know every time that we face those situations that God is big enough. He is bigger than the storm. That's what the disciples forgot. They forgot how big God really is. That's why Jesus became so disappointed in them. Listen to this. When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the water, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. Can you just imagine what was freaking out the disciples suddenly goes poof, and it's gone. You can just imagine their adrenaline was so high and they were so freaking out. They were probably crying. And then in an instant, it was done. Everything was calm. And you can just imagine how they must have felt in that moment. Why was I so afraid? Look at what Jesus did. And that's exactly what the problem was. Jesus was like, why were you freaking out? Don't you remember all the miracles I have done? Do you honestly think this storm is too big for me? You see, the disciples, they had seen Jesus do tremendous miracles. Jesus had healed people of diseases that were incurable. He multiplied food to feed huge crowds of people. He raised people from the dead. He drove out demons out of people that other people had given up on. I mean, miracle after miracle. They should have remembered those miracles. They should have remembered and taken heart that God can do all that. If He can do all that, He can surely take care of the storm. And it's the same that you and I need to realize. We need to remember all the miracles God has done, both in our own life and in the Bible, and say, you know what? Yes, this is a huge storm and it is scary, but I serve a God who is bigger. I serve a God who has already calmed the storm. He can certainly take care of this one.
That's right.
He can heal your marriage. He can provide a new job. He can heal you of your illness. He can do all of those things and more. He is the God who can calm your storm.
Amen.
But you've got to be obedient. You've got to walk the path that He has chosen for you. He has laid out for you. You need to remain calm and put your faith in Him as the God who can calm your storm.